Hello, welcome to a special session of the International Online Spinal Cord Injury Research Seminar Series. My name is Bethany Candelas. I am the chair of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee of the IOSCARs, and joining me today is Dr. Peggy Assinck. So today's session is a bit different. We are pre-recording, so we are not going live like we normally do. And this is going to be a discussion that's going to stay on the channel. And it's a launch of an ongoing effort that the IOSCARs is undertaking to increase inclusiveness in research and in research spaces. So we're going to be asking at the end of this session for people to share their experiences and their stories as a way to highlight opportunities to remove barriers for people who conduct research. So as a special launch of this effort, we're joined today by Peggy, and she and I are going to discuss some of her experiences as a spinal cord injury researcher who is also a wheelchair user. So we're going to start today with a wheelchair user because it is, a disability that, as spinal cord injury researchers, something we are thinking a lot about. But we want to make sure that we make clear that we're interested in stories from all different types of be it an invisible or visible disabilities or any other discriminated group that encounters barriers that stops them from participating in research and coming to lab, coming to research spaces, etc. So as I said, Peggy and I are going to talk a little bit about her experiences, and then stay tuned at the end because we'll give some more instructions about how we want our community to help us with this effort and to help improve accessibility in research. So first off, hi, thank you, Peggy, so much for joining us. So let's just start really broad. Can you just tell us broadly about your disability and also about your research path thus far?
Perfect. Thank you so much for having me today. I think it's such an important topic and I'm really excited to be here. So broadly about my disability. So I was actually born with spina bifida, which is a neural tube defect. I was born in rural Canada, so I wasn't actually diagnosed with spina bifida when I was young. And I really had no physical disability or impairments whatsoever until I was 11 years old. And at that point, I sustained a tethered cord. So what that meant was that I had scar tissue that bound around the base of my spinal cord. And as I was growing throughout my adolescence, I essentially sustained non-traumatic stretched spinal cord injuries. They call it tethered cord syndrome. And it affected me for basically from about 11 till 19. And I had many, many spinal cord surgeries to go in, release my cord, and try and decrease the amount of ongoing damage that I was sustaining. So when I came out of that as a 19-year-old who was interested in neuroscience and interested in regeneration because of the experiences that I'd had, I was a person with a lumbar incomplete spinal cord injury, and it affected me very differently from time to time. So I have lots of devices in my life. I have braces for my legs, I have crutches, I have wheelchairs, etc. So I make use of lots of devices. But there are times where it's almost an invisible disability where I'm only affected a little bit from the outside, from what people can see. And there's also times where it affects me quite a bit more. I have cerebrospinal fluid leaks that move around on my spinal cord and can really influence how easily I'm able to walk. And so, when I decided to go into academia, I was somebody who at times was labeled as having a more invisible disability, and at times and more often as I get older, I'm using my wheelchair most of the time because it decreases my fatigue and really allows me to be kind of the successful, productive person that I attempt to be. And so that's a bit about my disability and kind of when I entered academia, where I was at. And then just a little bit about me and my research path so far. So I was really excited about learning about neuroscience after all of my childhood experiences. I took a neuroscience undergraduate degree and then did my master's and PhD work in spinal cord injury. And now I'm doing postdoc opportunities and looking at myelination a little bit more so, but spinal cord injury research really is at the heart of what it is that I do and what I'm hoping to come back to. And so in that path, I've really had lots of opportunities to work and, work within lots of different institutions, within lots of different labs, to do secondment opportunities in different universities across Canada as well as internationally. And so I'm going to tell you a lot about different experiences that I've had along the way and how they've changed over time.
Great. Well, thank you so much for coming and sharing your story with us today. So as you said, you kind of said you've had a lot of different experiences, a lot of different places. Can you tell us just some of the barriers that you have encountered, be they tangible or intangible, across your research career so far?
Absolutely. So I think it's important to highlight there is a lot of barriers. This could be a very long conversation, but just to highlight some of them, I think one of the biggest ones that not all institutes and universities are aware of is that within the disabled community, it is well known which universities are considered accessible universities. And so one of the biggest barriers is that university considered an accessible university? Can I get into most lecture halls? Do they have accommodation for somebody who is a wheelchair user, et cetera? So I think that's a big barrier that comes into play in the beginning. And then as I went through kind of my university experiences, whether or not lecture halls are accessible. So whether or not I could even get into those lecture halls. And even if I can get into the lecture halls, is it one of the theater style lecture halls where I can only wheel in from the very top, not sit anywhere near any of my students who are around me, and probably can't ask questions, probably can't access the professor, probably can't hand in my work, etc. So kind of that difference between, okay, is the space accessible versus is it inclusive to me as a wheelchair user? And, things like lab accessibility. If you go into science, whether it's that you're taking an undergrad course in chemistry and you need to access the chemistry lab that's associated with your course, or as you start to get more interested in research within a particular research lab, can you access those research labs? Are they in a building that is accessible? Is there a wheelchair accessible bathroom nearby? Is there somewhere that you can safely do the research that you need to do? And I think that a lot of times the answer is there or no. And so there's a lot of barriers involved in finding a lab that's accessible, finding a university that's accessible, that kind of goes into planning where it is that you're going to go and how you're going to make those decisions moving forward. Now, as I became more involved in research, things like animal facilities. Many animal facilities are not very inclusive to people, especially if you're a wheelchair user, if it's a barrier facility, et cetera. So there's definitely concerns there. I think that health and safety is really great because the priority is to make sure that as people who are working and students, et cetera, that health and safety precautions are put in place, but often they're made for an able-bodied person. And so I've actually found many of the restrictions and the barriers that I've come up against are actually because of too many health and safety rules that don't apply to me and actually are creating larger barriers for myself. Logistically, really simple things like, if I'm working in tissue culture, can I actually access the tissue culture hood? And there's lots of great tissue culture hoods that are low and perfect for a wheelchair user, but most labs don't have them. Or simple things like fume hoods, right? There is a safety component to making use of a fume hood, and yet sitting as a wheelchair user, my face is right in the sash space that is considered unsafe. And then also just around lectures. Can you access lectures and lab meetings and journal clubs and all those bits and pieces that are really important for your training career? And do you need special permissions for them? One of the really good examples that I have is I remember wanting to go to this really great lecture and clicking the little box at the bottom that said that I was a wheelchair user. And the result of clicking that box was like back and forth emails, filling out forms with emergency action plans, how I'm going to get in the building, how I'm going to get out of the building, getting permission from my PI to go to said lecture so that somebody else had to take the responsibility if there was an accessibility issue. Like, it just opened up a huge amount of work for me personally to be able to go to a 1-hour lecture that would have been really interesting. So there are so many barriers that are sometimes behind the scenes that other people don't necessarily even get the opportunity to see. I think a major barrier is a lack of funding to make the accessibility requirements that are needed. And to me, that's one of the biggest barriers, because I can be quite proactive. I can know what it is that I need, but if I can't actually get the funding to make that change, that is a massive barrier. And one of the important pieces there is that I want to make sure that I'm not being a burden, let's say, on the grants, the scientific grants within the lab, or causing too much issues, let's say, with my direct supervisor, right? And so in a perfect world, what I'd really want is funding that would allow for me to externally apply and say, I need this change. I need this height adjustable desk, something along those lines. And I need this to be successful, and be able to apply for that and get that in my life so that I'm empowered to do all the things that I need to do. But in reality, there is not a lot of funding in place for those types of situations. And so I think that I worry that sometimes that lack of funding that's there is actually a deterrent for people to either hire or take on students or hire staff with disabilities, because there's that concern that they don't have an accessible space and they don't have the funds to make it accessible. So it could just be easier to hire the person without the disability. And so I think that in my mind, those are major barriers that I would hope that we can kind of overcome. And so those are some of the tangible things that I can think about. I think there's also intangible things. And I think in a big way, we think a lot about accessibility and making sure that people can get into the spaces and maybe even make use of the spaces. But as I mentioned earlier, there's also a piece around inclusiveness. So not just that I can get into the spaces, but that I can easily integrate in and be surrounded by all the great, students or researchers, and be a part of all the really important conversations, and, be invited to the social, situation or the bar or whatever. If we're going paintballing, just, making sure that I'm actually included in all of the components that are really great about being part of a research lab. And I think that, there's also a lot of barriers there around assumptions that people make about what you can do, and assumptions that people make about what you need and what you don't need. And I think that those can be pretty large barriers as well in a lot of different situations. And there's lots of ways to overcome those barriers, but it's definitely something that I need to put active work into to try and decrease those barriers and increase inclusiveness for myself. But I've also been in lots of great situations where other people support that kind of becoming inclusive and making an inclusive environment. And it takes work. It's not just going to naturally happen. But in some of the best lab environments that I've been able to work in, there's been an acknowledgement that you need to both make sure that the environment's accessible, but it's also inclusive, right?
Yeah, thank you. And there's just so much that I think a lot of people it's not even on their radar about a lot of those hidden costs and that hidden just time and effort. And there's something you said that I kind of want to ask a little deeper about, and that's that if the space isn't really set up for you, something like working in a lab where you have health and safety concerns, there's a lot of chemicals and such. Do you feel like you've had to make choices about doing an experiment and being productive or being safe in ways that maybe you wouldn't have liked?
Yeah, I absolutely feel like I've had to make some of those decisions. I think there's times where lots of researchers make those decisions, but there's definitely a lot of situations like the fume hood example, or doing an experiment that's on a bench that's way too high with a high likelihood of spilling that on my legs, which are right there without a lab coat covering them. Those kind of pieces where you make the decisions that you need to make in order to do the research that you need to do. But in a perfect world, we would have less of those risks taking place over time as spaces become more accessible for everybody.
Yeah. Okay, so you kind of alluded to some of the things that have worked. So I maybe kind of give work for you in research spaces specifically. Are there a couple of success stories that you kind of want to take a minute so people can kind of hear ways that maybe they could be a part of helping people to have better access in research spaces?
Absolutely. So I think some of the successes are I've been really lucky to be able to go to some really accessible universities that have clearly put a lot of work into being accessible and making sure that people, let's say a wheelchair user, can actually access most spaces at the university. And a lot of labs or buildings that have put a lot of work into making sure that they are accessible. So there's a lot of success stories out there that are specific to access. As a student, I felt very well supported by disability support services throughout my my kind of coming up through academia, and that was a really rewarding piece where all of a sudden I had somebody who could help advocate for what it is that I need and had experience doing so. So that was definitely a really positive thing. And I think over time, just increasing the general education of people around me and understanding of disability, of spinal cord injury, of being a wheelchair user and what somebody needs. And I think that those have really helped for me to feel included. And I really would highlight them as successes. And I've been really lucky to be in a lot of lab environments that have been conducive to that.
Yeah, so thank you. And that kind of actually sort of gets this next question really nicely as well. Because you mentioned being an undergrad and having access to disability services, and then now you've been navigating in the research world for a couple of years now. How has your experiences? How have they changed? As you know, you went from undergrad to graduate to postdoc, from student to staff. Has things gotten better? Have things gotten worse? Like, how has that evolved as you've moved through research over the past couple of years?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm obviously a little bit old, so there's probably a time component here. And I like to think that everything's becoming more accessible over time. But I think really to highlight during my undergrad, once I found an accessible university and I had the supports of disability services to help me navigate, if a lecture hall needed to be moved or if, I needed to find the best way to be able to access the chemistry lab, those kind of pieces. I actually felt well supported in kind of my undergrad and my PhD experiences. More so than I did as time went on and as I transitioned to being a postdoc and being more of a staff member. So I think I do have to praise the way in which, at least in the universities that I attended, there was support systems in place for a lot of the disability issues that I had. Now, obviously, I think one thing that's really important to highlight here is that you need to feel comfortable with disclosing that you have a disability in order to access disability services. And, as a wheelchair user, I think I have a very quite a noticeable disability in my day-to-day life. That felt very comfortable for me to have that conversation. But I think it's important to highlight that a lot of people do not feel comfortable with disclosing their disabilities and don't have access to disability services such that they have somebody to help them navigate and advocate for them. So I feel very lucky in the fact that those were positive experiences that I had going through as a student. But I think it really helped to highlight that as I transitioned into postdoc and staff sort of mode, that there was less and less support there, less and less understanding of disability, less disability support services. And I found that really tough to navigate. And I didn't expect that, because as I've gone through my academic world, I've become a better advocate for what it is that I need. I better understand what's out there. My problem solving skills are getting really good. I can solve a lot of problems, but I felt that there was support that I had as a student all of a sudden very quickly disappeared becoming a staff member. And so a really great example of that is as a postdoc, I have been known to work outside of 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, as many postdocs do and many students do. And one really interesting example as a staff member is that because I was a wheelchair user and they didn't feel they could guarantee my safe exit in case of an emergency, that I was never allowed to work outside 9 to 5. And the only exception to that was that I could work outside 9 to 5 if I could find somebody to work with me, but they had to work within like a 10-foot proximity of me the entire time I was outside 9 to 5, right? And that was a health and safety precaution that just was totally acceptable to them. And so that's an example where that was in place and I struggled to fight it, and there was no support in place from anyone to be able to try and fight that. And so that was just an interesting sort of side to things where I didn't feel like I had anyone to get that level of support for or from. I think also there just was more barriers specific to, as I became more specialized in my research, I needed access to more fancy microscopes or more facilities or more access to different universities that had different components. And every time I needed to do that, I needed to go through health and safety discussions. I needed to come up with entry and exit plans. And there just became more and more barriers really to my time, but also just to my actual ability to access things. Great example, wanted access to an animal facility, knew that I could do it, had to wait for 4 months for 5 committees to meet to decide whether the wheelchair user was allowed to access the one animal facility, right? So there are a lot of bureaucracy behind the scenes that have actually become pretty large barriers for me that I think that are solvable problems, if that makes sense. I think also just, smaller things like access to accommodations. You're moving to a different country, you're hoping to find an accommodation in somewhere that you can be as a wheelchair user, but not a lot of support in your ability to do those things. And there's, that definitely felt like quite a barrier as I was starting to move around a lot more for the decisions regarding my research. But I also think one of the biggest barriers that I noticed is around funding, as I've pointed out, and just making sure that we have access to the funds that are required to make small accommodations in the workplace that make big differences. One, thing worth highlighting is I was really lucky enough to be awarded a Marie Curie Award. And once you were awarded a Marie Curie Award, they actually had a grant that if you had a disability that you could apply for extra grant money to make all the accommodations that you needed so you could be successful. And that was the first time that I'd ever seen, a system like that. And I was really lucky to be awarded that. But very few people have the opportunity to be awarded that award and get access to that funds, right? So there are situations where I can see some really positive pieces happening there. But I think, as I've become a postdoc and moved around more, it's also highlighted more around the barriers and the time that gets put into making sure that you can access spaces that everyone else kind of takes for granted there. I think another thing just worth highlighting is, I'm really interested in getting lots of diverse research experiences from lots of different places. I made a decision to move to another country for my postdoc, which is great, but something I hadn't really thought through is that I would be on a work visa in another country. And part of my work visa in the United Kingdom very clearly stipulates that even though I pay my taxes in this country, that I am not allowed to access any public funds. And so what that means is, as a person with a disability, I have no access to disability support from the country. And therefore, the university assumes I'm getting disability support from the country. And the country assumes that the university will be covering everything. And you kind of end up in this hole where there's absolutely no help and support to deal with the extra costs and the extra needs for a person with a disability. So, I think that it's kind of been a really interesting perspective going from undergrad all the way up and through. And I think there's lots of successes there around supporting students with disabilities, but there's also still lots of barriers that I think we need to overcome and try and get more people into the academic setting young and feeling more supported as students all the way through, but also remembering how important it is to support them as staff and support them as PIs and support them as, and unfortunately, I think it really depends on who your manager is and who your what institute you happen to be in, and a lot of work put in behind the scenes to make sure that you as a person with a disability are going to one of those places. And I would imagine lots of people who have stories where they haven't gone to one of those places, right?
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting. And I would like to take us another minute to sort of dig in a little bit, because I think you highlight really a lot of the hidden costs and the hidden time and effort that maybe a lot of people wouldn't really think about when it comes to your need to pay attention to accessible spaces and how that affects where you get to go for the next stage of your career. So I mean, you've kind of alluded to this in a couple of the previous questions, but it might be helpful just to sort of really dig into like what that extra cost was for you and how much that might have affected your decision about what to do next with your career.
Absolutely. And I think it really comes into play. And as anyone who's interested in joining a lab for whatever reason, there's always the go and meet your PI, make sure that it's a great lab environment. But there's a lot of extra things that need to be thought about as a wheelchair user, for example. And I needed to go to that facility and really figure out whether all the rooms were accessible and not just the building. I needed to ask the questions like, can I work outside 9 to 5 in this building? If I need to work in the animal facility, how are we going to make that happen? Are the, other buildings that aren't the one I'm working in all the time, is that actually accessible? Can I access the EM microscope that is in that old building that has that elevator that's probably broken most of the time? So I think there's a lot more behind the scenes sort of investigating that you need to do. And as I highlighted, even when I first made my decision on what undergrad university to go to, trying to figure out whether it was considered an accessible university and whether that university had put the time and energy into making sure that it was as accessible and inclusive as it possibly could be. So I think that there's a lot of work that needs to be done there. And unfortunately, it's often always put on the person with the disability to figure out whether it will work for them, with very little follow-up of what can we do to make it work for you. It's very much, will this work for you? And if it will, we might think about having you here. And if it won't, oh, that's unfortunate. So I think that we need to be putting more work and energy into making sure that more spaces are actually accessible. As I've moved around more and had more exposure to more places, it's become quite clear to me that there's lots of amazing places that are very accessible, but there's lots of places that are not accessible. And it's sometimes a circular problem, right? If you have an inaccessible institute or university, nobody who's a wheelchair user attends that university. Nobody points out how inaccessible everything is, and no change happens. And yet you look back and realize that nobody who's a wheelchair user has attended that university in many, many years. And so I think that, there needs to be active work done here and not just putting out fires when they come up.
Yeah. So that we talked a lot about kind of institutional sort of things that are in place, barriers and successes. But now maybe drilling down a little more to an interpersonal level with colleagues and people you've interacted with. So are there things that your colleagues, individuals have done that are helpful as you navigate either successful institutions or maybe less successful places and spaces? And also what's not helpful? When you're in spaces that people might think they're being helpful, but turns out maybe not so much.
Absolutely. So I think when I reflect upon the most helpful colleagues that I've had, I think the first step is really just creating a really comfortable back and forth atmosphere where people feel comfortable about asking me about my disability and asking what it is that I need, but also listening to my answer. I think sometimes there's a lot of assumptions around what I can and can't do that people make assumptions, but without actually asking me. And if they had just had that dialogue and felt comfortable enough with asking me, that we could have been much more proactive and been problem solvers in a much more efficient way. So I think that some of the most inclusive environments I've been in are environments where people are comfortable about addressing and talking about disability, that people are asking what it is that I need and listening to the answer to that. Facility managers and PIs who are saying, listen, I recognize that there may be barriers for you and we can't solve all of them, but let's talk about some of the small ones that we can solve that will improve your day-to-day life. Actually having that communication and not expecting the person with the disability to always be advocating for themselves at every step along the way have really created that awesome environment that have helped me to really be successful in the different areas that I've been in. Now, I have to say I have put a lot of work into this. I've realized as I've gotten older and as I've gone through more spaces that it's really important that I educate people around me about my disability and why it changes and why it fluctuates and create an open dialogue where somebody can feel comfortable with asking the follow-up question. So I also think that, there is a lot of work that can be done on both sides around educating colleagues so that there's just more comfortable back and forth dialogue specific to disability. And I think that kind of is the biggest thing I can highlight.
Yeah, so thank you for that. I think a lot of us can kind of take that to heart. And part of the reason we're all here for this session even is to start having more of those dialogues and conversations and opening that all up. So you're an aspiring PI, hoping to have your own research lab someday. So why don't you just kind of tell us about that ideal research space you would like to build?
Perfect. So okay, ideal working, research lab. I think the biggest thing is I want a lab that is inclusive to everybody. But because we're talking about disability today, I want a lab that is inclusive for people with disabilities. And the first thing that I think we need to do is we need to create and make academia and therefore research more accessible for people with disabilities. So I want for a person who is a wheelchair user, for example, to be able to get a scholarship to get into a university in their undergrad, get excited about science, and that scholarship could help them overcome many of the barriers associated with the costs of living, of having a disability, and the barriers associated with getting to and from home, to class, and around their university. So that's the first thing that I think needs to be in place so that I can populate my lab with more people who may or may not have disabilities. I think that we want to, in addition to that, around supporting people with disabilities, I think we need to make sure that there's more independent grants and training grants that are specific to supporting people with disabilities to have really great opportunities, or to make great opportunities accessible for people with disabilities, right? And I think those need to just become more a part of conversations within our academic institutions, within conferences, within all those different bits and pieces. I wish that there was more clarity around what is accessible and what isn't. I would wish that my potential students could go online and actually see with a couple of clicks how accessible the university is, and that the university has actually, decided that 95% of the rooms at that university, or 90% of the research spaces, are actually accessible to, at bare minimum, get in the door of those different research spaces. So informing people so that that person isn't obligated to come to every single university they're thinking about and wander around the entire school to figure out what they can and can't do, right? I think that those pieces are a big piece. And then also, in my ideal lab situation, I would be supporting the university to make sure that their health and safety rules are taking into account people with disabilities. Because I've actually found many of the barriers for myself have been geared around health and safety rules that make a lot of sense for able-bodied people, but actually become a barrier for myself. So I would be wanting to create a much better dialogue back and forth with regards to that. And then I think, I would want to create an environment that is accessible, as we talked about, and more inclusive. But part of that is around helping to support people with disabilities or long-term health issues with disclosing that they have a disability or a long-term health issue. It's actually quite an issue within academia. We know that there are tons of people who self-identify as disabled or having long-term health issues. Very few of them feel comfortable with sharing it with their colleagues, with their bosses, with HR. And so I would try and create a world where that was a more comfortable conversation, where people didn't fear whether or not they were going to get the job if they disclosed, or fear whether or not it meant people assuming they'd be less productive because of it, or those bits and pieces. And then, so that's kind of creating this atmosphere that is inclusive to people with disabilities. And then it would just be this amazing place where every single person could access every single piece of equipment, right? And the truth of it is that, a cryostat that is height adjustable allows for you to stand up and do cutting, and for me to sit in my wheelchair and do cutting. And, there are so many really great pieces of equipment out there. And so as people are thinking about buying new equipment, take a minute and just think, maybe we spend a little bit more on that one piece of equipment that will be inclusive for absolutely everybody. So I think that those kind of highlight a lot of the things that I would want in my perfect research space. As I highlighted before, just making sure that everybody can access the space all the time. This is an important point that I have. And I think that if there had been more research lab spaces like that, that I would have had less barriers. And I think that if we could put a lot of these things in place, we would actually have more people with physical disabilities involved in academia, making decisions, involved in research. And specific to our spinal cord injury research world, we want people with lived experience to be contributing, whether it be as researchers, whether it be at journal clubs, whether it be at discussions around granting, but we need for them to be able to access those spaces and not just access them, but feel included in those dialogues as well. So I think that there's lots of work to do there, but there's also lots of successes that I can highlight that I've had people in spaces that have really empowered me to become who I am and be resilient through all of those experiences to be in the research world that I am now and that I hope to continue to be in for a long time. So.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Peggy, for sharing your experiences. I think it was definitely very educational for me to kind of just be able to hear your insights and how maybe different the navigation process of being in research has been for you versus me. And I hope that a lot of people listening today have sort of learned a bit about what it might be like to access these spaces. And now as we try to go on and be a part of an ongoing dialogue to build that ideal research environment, we'd like to turn to our community and really try and make this dialogue an ongoing one that's not just today. And so the goal of the DEI, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee on the IOSCRs is to make science accessible to everyone. And so to continue to build this ideal research space that no one is excluded from. So today, Peggy joined us and we focused specifically on physical disability, but we want to hear from anyone who has encountered a barrier in a research space, be it for any reason. So I've put a submission link in the description below, and we're asking for folks to submit just a single slide or image that we will then go on to share on Twitter and also in future intro slide decks for future online seminars. You can be anonymous or not, so if you'd like to include like your Twitter handle or your email, if you want anyone to contact you about the story you're sharing, the success that you're sharing, or if you want people to ask you more questions, it's up to you. Include your contact info or not. But we are just asking for a single slide or a single image that sort of describes barriers that you've encountered and ways of constructive solutions, things that you've done to navigate them, and how there might be more solutions and barriers might be removed. We ask that you try to be specific and personal and sort of pointed, so highlighting solutions and things that work, or learning experiences. Do refrain, we ask you don't include any specific locations or people. And these stories that you share can be about large-scale things at the institutional level, or more specific colleagues or specific things that a single individual can do. So as always, so please do submit those stories. We will be including them in future seminars. It's just a single slide, so we're always kind of having this conversation and having this dialogue and sort of continuing to focus on it as a really important part of what we're doing. So as always, our DMs and email, please let us know as we try to build better, more inclusive research spaces. We want to hear from you about how we can do that better. And with that, I'd like to say thank you again very much to Peggy. Thank you for giving us your time and sharing your story. And we will see everyone on the next IOSCRs seminar.